You're fired. Get your coffee and get out of my control room.
The CEO shouted as a massive ransomware attack crippled the company's entire network. While executives panicked and millions of files were being encrypted, the quiet black IT engineer calmly took one last sip of coffee. Everyone thought he was useless. But no one knew the attack had actually been triggered by the CIO himself while trying to erase evidence of a multi-million-dollar fraud. Even worse for the CIO, the man he had just humiliated wasn't an ordinary IT employee. He was the one person capable of exposing every secret the company had been hiding. The morning sky above Arlington, Virginia, was covered by heavy gray clouds that reflected off the glass towers of the city's thriving technology district. A cold wind swept through the streets, but inside the headquarters of Sentinel Cyber Defense, one of the largest cybersecurity companies in the United States, the atmosphere was far colder than the weather outside. Rows of massive monitoring screens suddenly flashed crimson as security alerts erupted across the company's global network. Hundreds of cybersecurity analysts, engineers, and incident responders filled the Security Operations Center, their voices overlapping as alarms echoed through the room. Servers from New York to Los Angeles were reporting simultaneous encryption attempts, and every second that passed meant another customer database could be lost forever. Among the sea of frantic employees sat one man who appeared completely untouched by the chaos. Marcus Carter, a 35-year-old African-American cybersecurity engineer, leaned comfortably in his chair while quietly studying 6 large monitors arranged in a perfect semicircle around his workstation. Standing just over 6 feet tall with an athletic build earned from years of disciplined exercise, Marcus had deep brown skin, a sharply defined jawline, neatly trimmed beard, and calm dark eyes that rarely revealed emotion. His short natural black hair was always neatly maintained, and despite working for one of America's most prestigious technology firms, he preferred wearing a simple black hoodie, dark jeans, and worn sneakers instead of expensive business attire. Years earlier, after surviving a devastating cyber attack that nearly destroyed a nonprofit organization he had volunteered for, Marcus had developed an almost unnatural ability to remain calm during crises, believing panic was always a greater enemy than any computer virus. While dozens of engineers shouted possible solutions across the room, Marcus quietly lifted a paper coffee cup to his lips and continued watching streams of system logs scroll across his monitors. "Something's wrong," whispered a young security analyst nearby. The analyst was Emily Brooks, a 28-year-old cybersecurity specialist with shoulder-length auburn hair tied into a neat ponytail and bright green eyes hidden behind rectangular glasses. Intelligent but still relatively new to large-scale incident response, Emily had built a reputation for working harder than almost anyone on her team. Her hands trembled slightly as she noticed unfamiliar processes spreading across multiple international servers. "The encryption is moving too fast," she said. Several engineers immediately began typing commands as hundreds of company devices started disappearing from the monitoring dashboard. Then the reinforced glass doors burst open. Richard Hawthorne strode into the Security Operations Center with long, impatient steps. Only 48 years old, Richard had recently been promoted to Chief Executive Officer after years of climbing the corporate ladder through aggressive acquisitions and ruthless business decisions. He stood over 6'2" with broad shoulders, perfectly tailored navy designer suits, polished Italian shoes, and carefully styled silver-streaked dark hair. His clean-shaven face featured sharp cheekbones and piercing blue eyes that often made employees feel as though they were being interrogated rather than spoken to. Although undeniably intelligent, Richard believed authority was demonstrated through intimidation, and he had become known throughout the company for publicly humiliating employees who failed to meet his expectations. He scanned the room. Everyone was working frantically. Everyone, except one man. Richard's eyes locked onto Marcus, who calmly took another sip of coffee while reading another page of scrolling code. His face immediately darkened. "What exactly are you doing?" Richard shouted loud enough for the entire operations center to hear. The room instantly fell silent. Marcus slowly lowered his coffee cup but never looked away from the monitors. "I'm watching the attack," he answered quietly. Richard laughed sarcastically. "Watching it?" He stepped closer until he was standing directly behind Marcus's chair. "The entire company is on fire, and you're sitting here drinking coffee?" Several department managers exchanged nervous glances. No one dared interrupt. Richard pointed directly at Marcus. "If you're as good as Human Resources claims, fix it." Marcus remained calm. "I need another minute." Richard slammed his palm against the edge of the workstation. "You don't have another minute." A few managers forced nervous smiles, hoping to stay on the CIO's good side. One of them even chuckled under his breath. Richard noticed. His confidence grew. He folded his arms and spoke even louder. "Maybe we've been paying you to look intelligent instead of actually doing your job." The laughter spread quietly through one corner of the room. Emily looked down at her keyboard, clearly uncomfortable. Marcus still said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on one particular line hidden among millions of incoming records. Something about the attack didn't make sense. The malware wasn't behaving like ordinary ransomware. It almost looked as though someone inside the company had accidentally opened the front door for it. Richard mistook Marcus's silence for fear. "If you can't solve this," he said coldly, "start cleaning out your desk." At that exact moment, every monitor inside the operations center changed simultaneously. The flashing warning banners disappeared. A new message replaced them. Encryption started. Across hundreds of servers, millions of customer files began locking one after another. Gasps echoed throughout the room. Emily covered her mouth. Several engineers froze. Richard's confident expression slowly disappeared. For the first time that morning, even he realized the company might actually be losing everything. What no one inside the room knew was that only a few minutes earlier, Richard Hawthorne himself had unknowingly triggered the disaster while attempting to erase evidence of financial crimes hidden deep inside the company's servers. Dark clouds still hung over Arlington, Virginia, refusing to break even as the morning wore on. Inside Sentinel's cyber defense, the cold light from hundreds of computer monitors illuminated anxious faces while the company's global network continued slipping toward disaster. The security operations center had become almost unbearable. Engineers argued over possible containment strategies. Security analysts shouted conflicting instructions, and every passing second brought another wave of encrypted files. Millions of customers depended on Sentinel to protect their digital lives, yet the company itself seemed powerless against the attack unfolding before everyone's eyes. Marcus Carter quietly placed his coffee cup on the desk and slowly rose from his chair. Unlike everyone else, he neither hurried nor panicked. His expression remained steady as his eyes continued following the malicious code racing through the network. After several seconds of silent observation, he finally spoke in the same calm voice that somehow carried across the noisy room. "Everyone, please step away from your keyboards." No one moved. Several engineers barely even looked up. One senior network administrator frowned before continuing to type. "We don't have time for this." Another analyst shook his head. "If we stop now, we'll lose the European servers." Marcus remained perfectly still. "I know," he answered quietly. "That's exactly why you need to stop." Richard Hawthorne folded his arms and let out a mocking laugh. "So now you're giving orders?" The CO slowly walked toward Marcus until they were standing only a few feet apart. "You've been sitting there drinking coffee while everyone else is actually working." His voice became louder with every word. "And now you expect an entire incident response team to listen to you?" A few department managers exchanged amused smiles. One whispered just loudly enough for others nearby to hear. "He really thinks he's running this place." Soft laughter spread across one corner of the operations center. Marcus ignored every comment. Instead, he reached toward his keyboard and typed a sequence of commands unlike anything anyone else in the room had ever seen. There were no ordinary administrative tools, no familiar security applications, and no emergency recovery software listed anywhere on the display. The command window accepted a long encrypted authentication string before every monitor connected to Marcus's workstation suddenly dimmed. For 2 long seconds, nothing happened. Then an entirely different interface slowly appeared. A black screen, simple white lettering, one company logo. Beneath it were 4 words. "Found a recovery environment." The room instantly fell silent. Even the constant alarms seemed less noticeable. Several senior engineers stared at the screen in complete confusion. Emily Brooks blinked twice before adjusting her glasses. "I've never seen that system before." Neither had anyone else. Richard frowned. "What is that?" Marcus didn't answer. He continued entering commands while hidden recovery partitions deep inside Sentinel's infrastructure quietly began responding one after another. Servers that had disappeared from every monitoring dashboard suddenly started appearing again, not online yet, but waiting for instructions. Richard's irritation returned. "I asked you a question." Still, no response. Before Richard could say another word, the reinforced security doors at the far end of the operations center opened once again. This time, nobody announced the visitor. Everyone simply stopped moving. Walking calmly through the room was an elderly gentleman in his early 70s whose presence alone demanded respect. William Prescott, the chairman of Sentinel Cyber Defense's board of directors, carried himself with quiet confidence that had been earned through decades of leadership rather than displays of authority. He was tall despite his age, with neatly combed silver hair, thoughtful gray eyes, and a distinguished face framed by a closely trimmed white beard. Dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit with a dark blue tie, William had built a reputation across the technology industry as a leader who listened far more than he spoke. Employees often said he could read a room within seconds, a skill developed after surviving several corporate crises that had shaped both his wisdom and his humility. Richard immediately straightened his jacket. "Mr. Prescott, But William walked past him without slowing down. His eyes were fixed entirely on the unfamiliar recovery interface glowing across Marcus's monitors. He stopped, read the screen, then looked directly at Marcus. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. It was as though they understood something no one else in the room did. William's serious expression slowly softened into the faintest smile. Without hesitation, he extended his hand. Marcus accepted it. The chairman shook it firmly. "It's been a long time," William said warmly. Marcus nodded. "I was hoping we'd never have to use it." So was I. Every employee inside the operations center stared in disbelief. Emily looked from Marcus to the chairman and back again. Richard's face had gone completely pale. He had expected the chairman to demand answers. Instead, the most powerful man in the company had greeted the quiet cybersecurity engineer like an old friend. William turned toward the hundreds of stunned employees surrounding them. "I suppose most of you have never seen this system before." Nobody answered. The founder recovery environment was designed for one purpose. He glanced toward Marcus before continuing. To rebuild Sentinel from the ground up if every other defense ever failed. The room remained frozen. Richard forced an uneasy laugh. "I wasn't aware we had anything like that." William slowly looked toward him. "That doesn't surprise me." The words were polite, but their meaning landed like a hammer. Marcus quietly continued working while dozens of encrypted servers began reconnecting through the isolated recovery environment. Green indicators slowly replaced red warning symbols across several monitoring screens. For the first time since the attack began, hope returned to the room. Richard watched the recovery process with growing unease. He had spent months learning every executive report, every financial document, and every department under his authority. Yet he had never heard a single word about the system now saving his company. More importantly, he had never seen anyone inside Sentinel command the respect that Marcus had just received from the chairman himself. As William stood silently beside the quiet engineer, Richard Hawthorne felt something he had not experienced in many years. The uncomfortable realization that he might have just humiliated the one person in the building he should never have underestimated. A cold afternoon rain settled over Arlington, turning the city's streets into shimmering reflections beneath dark skies. Inside Sentinel cyber defense, however, the storm outside seemed insignificant compared to the one quietly forming within the executive offices. Just 34 minutes after Marcus Carter activated the founder recovery environment, the impossible had happened. One by one, encrypted servers returned online. Database clusters reconnected. Cloud backups synchronized perfectly. Every customer account reappeared exactly as it had existed before the attack. Not a single file had been permanently lost. Across the massive security operations center, exhausted engineers slowly lowered their hands from their keyboards. Moments earlier, they had been preparing for the largest cybersecurity disaster in the company's history. Now they watched thousands of green status indicators replace the sea of flashing red warnings. Applause erupted throughout the room. Some employees laughed from pure relief. Others simply sat in silence, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Emily Brooks wiped away tears she hadn't realized were forming. "I've never seen anything like this," she whispered. Marcus simply closed the recovery console. Without celebrating, without accepting congratulations, he quietly picked up the same paper coffee cup that had become the target of so much ridicule less than an hour earlier. Only one person in the room wasn't relieved. Richard Hawthorne. The CIO stared at one particular monitoring screen. His heartbeat accelerated, because hidden among the restored databases were files he believed should no longer exist: financial archives, encrypted accounting ledgers, private executive emails, vendor payment histories. Every document he had desperately tried to erase only hours earlier had returned exactly as they had been. Richard slowly remembered everything that had happened before sunrise. He had entered the executive server room using his personal administrator credentials. Waiting inside a locked briefcase had been a small encrypted USB device supplied by an outside technology consultant. The consultant had promised him something simple: a custom program capable of permanently deleting years of digital evidence. Evidence that connected Richard to a sophisticated corruption scheme hidden beneath Sentinel's impressive reputation. For nearly 18 months, he had secretly approved inflated cybersecurity contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. Those contracts were awarded to shell companies secretly controlled by business partners, who funneled portions of the money back through offshore accounts. Internal audit reports questioning the payments had quietly disappeared before reaching the board of directors, while legitimate vendors who refused to participate suddenly found their contracts canceled. Even worse, several smaller customer data breaches had been quietly concealed rather than reported to regulators. Richard had ordered security logs altered and compliance reports rewritten to protect Sentinel's stock price and preserve his own reputation as the company's successful new CIO. Everything, every payment, every altered report, every deleted investigation had been stored inside the very servers now fully restored. Richard felt the color drain from his face. The program had never been intended to destroy the company's network. It had only been meant to erase his crimes. Instead, it had nearly destroyed the entire corporation. More importantly, Marcus had brought everything back. Every piece of evidence, every hidden transaction, every lie. Richard forced himself to smile as employees celebrated around him. Inside, panic had already taken control. Only one solution remained. If investigators ever examined the restored systems, someone else would have to take the blame. 3 hours later, the atmosphere inside Sentinel had completely changed. Employees received emergency calendar invitations ordering every department head, legal advisor, and senior manager into the executive conference auditorium. Marcus also received one. He arrived wearing the same black hoodie that had somehow become the symbol of the day's events. The room felt noticeably quieter as he entered. At the front of the auditorium stood Richard Hawthorne. His confidence had returned. Standing beside him was a woman few employees knew personally. Sophia Bennett, Sentinel's 46-year-old executive vice president of corporate communications, possessed the polished composure expected from someone who had spent 2 decades managing national media crises. She was tall and slender with shoulder-length dark brown hair, warm olive skin, and calm hazel eyes that rarely betrayed emotion. Sophia believed facts mattered more than public opinion, a philosophy shaped years earlier after watching false accusations destroy an innocent executive during a previous company scandal. She quietly reviewed a prepared statement. Richard stepped to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," the room became completely silent. "This morning's ransomware attack has been contained." Applause filled the auditorium. Richard waited for it to stop. Then his expression became serious. "However, I've received disturbing preliminary findings from our internal investigation." Marcus looked toward the stage. Richard slowly turned in his direction. "There is reason to believe that this attack may not have originated outside Sentinel at all." The room instantly became silent once again. Richard continued, "Our cybersecurity logs show that one individual possessed knowledge of systems unavailable to every other employee." He paused deliberately. "And only one individual restored the network with impossible speed." Employees slowly began looking toward Marcus. Richard lowered his voice. "In cybersecurity, the person who knows how to stop an attack is sometimes the very person who created it." As whispers spread across the auditorium, he simply looked at Richard with the same calm expression he had worn since the first alarm sounded that morning. It almost looked as though this accusation was exactly what he had been expecting all along. 3 days later, a cold rain drifted across Arlington, Virginia, wrapping the city in a gray mist that matched the uncertainty hanging over Sentinel's cyber defense. News vans lined the streets outside headquarters while federal investigators, board members, and reporters gathered inside for what many believed would determine the company's future. The executive auditorium had been transformed into an official investigative hearing. Every seat was occupied by senior managers, department heads, legal advisors, and cybersecurity specialists. At the front of the room sat representatives from the FBI Cyber Division alongside Sentinel's board of directors. The atmosphere felt less like a corporate meeting and more like a federal courtroom. Leading the investigation was Special Agent Daniel Foster, a 54-year-old FBI cybercrime investigator whose reputation had been built over nearly 3 decades dismantling international hacking organizations. Tall and broad-shouldered with closely cropped gray hair, sharp hazel eyes, and a weathered face marked by years of sleepless investigations, Foster spoke calmly but noticed details others overlooked. Years earlier, one failed cyber investigation had allowed millions of Americans' personal information to be stolen, and ever since then he trusted digital evidence far more than human testimony. Richard Hawthorne stood confidently before the audience. His expensive navy suit was perfectly pressed. His voice carried authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "our internal investigation confirms what I warned you about 3 days ago." Large presentation screens illuminated behind him. Dozens of technical diagrams appeared. Richard pointed confidently toward them. Marcus Carter possessed unauthorized access to systems unavailable to every other employee. Another slide appeared. He restored the network faster than any documented ransomware recovery in corporate history. Richard paused deliberately. "In my experience, the individual capable of reversing an attack so quickly is often the one responsible for creating it." Quiet whispers spread through the room. Several executives nodded. Even some engineers appeared uncertain. Richard continued presenting carefully selected system logs that showed Marcus accessing confidential recovery partitions moments before the ransomware disappeared. "What more evidence do we need?" Richard asked. "Nobody else could have done this." Agent Foster quietly folded his hands. "Mr. Hawthorne," he said calmly, "we appreciate your presentation. Now we'd like to hear from Mr. Carter." Every eye turned toward Marcus. Unlike Richard, Marcus carried no laptop, no stack of documents, no prepared presentation. He simply walked toward the front of the room carrying a small black external hard drive no larger than his hand. He placed it gently onto the conference table. Richard smiled confidently. "That's your defense?" Marcus looked directly at him. "No, it's the truth." The room became silent. Marcus connected the drive to the investigation workstation. A password screen appeared. He entered several authentication keys before an unfamiliar interface slowly loaded. Across the top of the display were 4 simple words. "Immutable Recovery Vault." Marcus finally spoke. 10 years ago, after Sentinel survived its first major cyber attack, I designed one system that could never be altered. He looked around the room. Not by an engineer, not by an executive, not even by me. Agent Foster leaned forward. "What makes it different?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "It records every administrative action in real time. It stores encrypted copies outside the production network. Once written, they can never be modified." He paused. "Ever." Richard's confident smile slowly faded. Marcus selected a folder labeled Executive Administrative Activity. Thousands of system logs appeared. He narrowed the search. The room watched every movement. Then one timestamp filled the center screen. 0:37 a.m. User, CEO action, administrative login successful. Marcus clicked the next record. 0:03 a.m. action, primary security monitoring disabled. Gasps echoed across the auditorium. Richard immediately stepped forward. "Those logs can be fabricated." Marcus said nothing. He opened another record. 3:09 a.m. action, unknown executable uploaded. Nile, cleanuppatch.exe, another click. 3:20 a.m. critical warning. Unauthorized encryption process detected. Automatic ransomware containment failed. Silence consumed the room. Richard's breathing became noticeably heavier. "No," he whispered. "That's impossible." Marcus calmly looked toward Agent Foster. "The vault records more than system logs." He selected another menu. Integrated Physical Security Archive. Security camera footage appeared. The timestamp matched exactly. 0:37 a.m. The executive server room. Richard Hawthorne entered alone carrying a black leather briefcase. He removed a small encrypted USB device, 0319. He inserted it into the executive server. The malware launched seconds later. Nobody spoke. The only sound inside the auditorium came from the server room recording itself. Richard stared motionless at the screen. His own face, his own hands, his own actions, repeated in perfect high definition. Marcus quietly turned back toward the audience. "I never accused Mr. Hawthorne. I simply preserved the truth." Agent Foster slowly stood.
"So the ransomware?"
Marcus nodded. "It wasn't created to attack Sentinel. It was activated after someone attempted to erase evidence." Another folder appeared. Financial records. Board members watched in disbelief as hidden payment schedules, shell company contracts, altered compliance reports, deleted internal audit findings, and secret offshore transfers filled the screens. Everything Richard had tried to destroy had survived. Every deleted email, every fraudulent contract, every hidden payment, every false report. Richard took one slow step backward. His face had turned completely white. For the first time since becoming CIO, he had absolutely nothing left to say. The evidence had spoken for him, and there was no defense left to offer. The rain had finally stopped over Arlington, Virginia, and the afternoon sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. Warm light reflected from the glass walls of Sentinel cyber defense, as if the city itself had been waiting for the truth to come into the open. Silence filled the executive auditorium. No one looked away as Special Agent Daniel Foster slowly approached Richard Hawthorne. The FBI agent standing beside him produced a pair of handcuffs while uniformed officers secured every exit. "Richard Hawthorne," Foster said calmly, "you are under federal investigation for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, obstruction of justice, destruction of corporate evidence, and violations of federal cybersecurity reporting laws." Richard opened his mouth, searching desperately for another explanation. None came. Seconds later, the former CIO of one of America's largest cybersecurity companies was led away in handcuffs before hundreds of employees who had once feared him. No applause followed. Only silence, because everyone understood they had just witnessed the collapse of a man who had nearly destroyed the company to protect himself. Within hours, federal investigators recovered thousands of hidden financial records from the Immutable Recovery Vault. The evidence confirmed millions of dollars had been diverted through shell corporations, government compliance reports had been falsified, customer data breaches had been concealed from regulators, and internal auditors who questioned the irregularities had quietly been dismissed or transferred. The ransomware attack had never been part of an outside conspiracy. It had been the disastrous consequence of Richard's desperate attempt to erase years of corruption. As FBI agents continued collecting evidence, William Prescott slowly walked to the front of the auditorium. He waited until every employee had turned toward him. "I believe," he said quietly, "there is something all of you deserve to know." The room became completely silent. William looked toward Marcus, who remained standing near the investigation table with the same quiet composure he had displayed since the crisis began. Most of you believe Marcus Carter is simply one of our senior cybersecurity engineers. A few employees nodded. William smiled. That's exactly how he wanted it. Confused whispers spread across the room. William continued. 12 years ago, when Sentinel Cyber Defense was still a small startup operating from 2 rented offices, Marcus founded our cyber defense division. Several employees stared in disbelief. He personally designed the security architecture that still protects every client we serve today. Another wave of whispers filled the auditorium. The founder recovery environment, William paused, was written entirely by him. Marcus lowered his eyes, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. The immutable recovery vault that exposed today's crimes. William smiled again. He built that too. The room had become completely motionless. William wasn't finished. Marcus also remained Sentinel's second largest shareholder. Gasps echoed throughout the auditorium. Many employees instinctively turned back toward Marcus. Several suddenly remembered seeing him helping interns carry equipment, repairing workstations late at night, and eating lunch alone in the employee cafeteria. None of them had ever imagined he owned a significant portion of the company. William folded his hands. Years ago, this board repeatedly offered Marcus the position of Chief Technology Officer. He looked toward Marcus, and every single time, he declined. Emily Brooks finally spoke. But why? Marcus smiled softly. For one simple reason. He slowly walked toward the center of the room. The higher you sit, the harder it becomes to see what's really happening. He glanced around at the employees. I wanted to know whether the systems I built were still protecting people. Then he looked toward the empty chair Richard Hawthorne had occupied only minutes earlier, and whether the culture we built was still worthy of protecting. The room fell silent once again. Marcus explained that he had intentionally continued working as an ordinary engineer because real problems rarely reached executive boardrooms. Employees spoke honestly to coworkers, not executives. By remaining anonymous, he could evaluate the company's technology, leadership, and ethics without anyone pretending to impress him. William nodded proudly. That decision saved Sentinel today. Later that afternoon, the board of directors unanimously appointed an interim leadership team, while federal investigators continued examining years of financial misconduct. William announced stronger compliance policies, independent cybersecurity oversight, and mandatory ethics reviews for every executive position. As employees slowly returned to the Security Operations Center, something remarkable happened. The same people who had laughed when Richard mocked Marcus now quietly stopped beside his workstation. Some apologized. Others simply thanked him. Marcus accepted every apology with the same calm kindness. He blamed no one. After the room finally emptied, he returned to the familiar corner desk where the entire story had begun. His black hoodie was unchanged. His 6 monitors displayed healthy green status lights across Sentinel's global network. He picked up the same paper coffee cup that Richard had ridiculed only days earlier. Taking one quiet sip, Marcus leaned back in his chair and watched the system dashboard settle into perfect stability. Outside the windows, sunlight reflected across the skyline. Inside the operations center, every screen glowed green. No alarms, no panic, only quiet confidence. This time, no one saw an ordinary engineer sitting alone in the corner. They saw the man who had built the company's defenses, protected its people without seeking recognition, and allowed the truth, not revenge, to bring justice. And from that day forward, whenever a new employee walked into Sentinel Cyber Defense and noticed the quiet man in the black hoodie drinking coffee while watching 6 monitors, nobody questioned whether he belonged there. Instead, they quietly nodded with respect before returning to work, knowing the safest place in the building was the desk where Marcus Carter sat.